Hey everyone, and welcome back. I'm Dave Ebner, and this is the second of two videos for this week. The lecture videos for primary elections. So thanks again for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the first video or maybe learned something. That's kind of the idea, I guess. So this second video, the first video is a more kind of like political sciencey, macro perspective, but also obviously really focused heavily on the theme of the class, targeting and mobilizing voters. So this second video though will be maybe a little bit shorter, but will be more kind of more on the ground focused and thinking about practically what we're going to be doing when we're targeting voters in a potential primary election. So let me kind of like put my other hat on here, my my campaign operative hat back on versus my political scientist hat. Um, but I think so. My experience working on primary elections is kind of thinking about it in two ways. So my first campaign as a field organizer for the Democratic Party, I worked on a special election. It was in Oregon, um, and the race was between so the seat had been vacated, right? So I don't want to get too many to the details, but it's one of the more kind of heinous and famous scandals that the Democratic Party had to go through, went through in terms of one of its candidates. I guess in the 2000s. So it was pretty good fodder for kind of the Daily Show and that kind of thing. It was terrible, but it was also there was some comedic aspects to it. Let's just say that. So, anyways, so I think you can probably narrow it down if you really want to go back there and look based on the information I've given you so far. But anyways, so this seat was open, and there was four or five candidates in the primary election. So I'll focus on the Republican side first. So the Republican side, kind of, it was established the same guy was going to run. He was more of a career candidate. He'd run a couple, I wouldn't maybe necessarily a career candidate, but he was it was a blue district, and it was a close district, but it was I think it was like a PVI maybe +2 +3. It'd been redrawn a couple of times. Anyways, so this guy had run a couple of times before, but kind of lost. He'd won the Republican Party primary pretty easily, and he was going to win this one pretty easily, and he was gonna be the candidate. Right? So voters kind of knew him, but they also knew him as the guy that lost a couple of times. There was more kind of activity on the Democratic side, where I think, and this kind of makes sense for the context in which we're thinking about this. It was kind of a typical thing. So we had a couple of a centrist candidate. So let's say a more business oriented kind of, I wouldn't say corporate, but kind of just a more typical kind of like run of the mill Democrat, right? Wants to reduce inequality, but keep taxes relatively low. Like not a super progressive kind of person. Now, the other major candidate in the Democratic primary, was a former, I think he was a state official of some, I can't remember exactly which one, a state official of some kind of, some kind of stripes. But then he's associated with the labor movement, really, kind of heavily associated with the labor movement and union organizing in the district, right? So you had your kind of like activisty progressive union candidate against your more moderate kind of centrist liberal Democrat, right? And this is what the primary was going to be about. And it was going to be a close primary, and kind of everybody knew it. And the polling indicated it right away. The centrist had also held had held I think maybe a legislative seat, so like a local office. So it was two pretty experienced political candidates, but ideologically different, and different identity-wise as well. So there are some significant differences there as well. So I think this is a pretty good example, and kind of like, I mean, it was my first experience working a primary, working within one, but I think it's like really kind of like the experience here carried through, and really kind of made sense regardless of what primary I was involved with that came after that. So this is a really good learning experience, but also it made a lot of sense. It taught me a lot of lessons that worked in the future as well. So you had your labor candidate versus your centrist, right? And the way that I would say they, because I was pretty new, but we were successful at targeting voters was with um, looking at, I think the way we looked at it first was the age of voters, right? So typically we thought that we would perform much better in a Democratic electorate, right? So it's just Democrats showing up. They're all registered Democrats. We think that first of all that older voters are more likely to show up at the polls. So in the previous video, I talked about who we're expecting to show up in primary elections. We're expecting regular voters to show up in polls, or show up in primaries. So we expect that older voters are going to be a big part of this election, and we have numbers indicating that we're performing better with older voters. So our message, our census message, is going over much better than the kind of this more progressive, let's change a lot of things message. So we think older voters are going to show up more, and we're doing better with older voters. So when we started targeting, not just for, well, I think maybe just, let's focus on voters. When we were trying to ID and mobilize voters, we were focusing on older voters. So the voter file, this is one of the obvious things that they'll give you, is just the age of the voter, right? So we knew that there was going to be a pretty big difference between how young voters felt and how old voters felt about this election. More importantly, we knew that older voters were our voters much more than they're for the other guy. So when we targeted our voter outreach, or when we thought about our messaging, and like designing our scripts that we were using for voter outreach, when we were building our list for voter outreach, when we were thinking about kind of what neighborhoods or what events our candidate would go to, we thought that older voters would do much better for us, and also they'd be more likely to show up in the primary than younger voters would, right? The other thing we kind of knew, that the other way that we can think about, so think about this as a Democrat, I think. So here's the transition. So we want to think about, in principle, if you're in a primary election, how do you go about targeting voters? So let's think about it first. Practice. So in this situation, we thought that older voters were for us. Younger voters were not. We were getting much better performance with the older voters, and we thought we were getting much better share with the older voters. And we also thought that when the rubber met the road, that they would also perform a lot better. They would show up more often for us, and just in general, so they would show up. So we should target them in our strategy. So in general, what we're thinking about here is, since we don't have party ID, we gotta find some way to break up the electorate, to segment the electorate. And I think that's the term that we'll settle on now. So I will just say that typically political science, if you look at like academic readings, they call this stuff like cleavages, which is just, I mean, it's too fifth grade, and I guess maybe I'm too fifth grade to use that term to describe this. So we're going to go with segments of the electorate, right? How do you break apart? How do you segment the electorate if you don't have party ID to rely on, right? All the people that are voting in your primary are going to be partisans, whether they're in a closed primary. In an open primary, this might be different, but in a closed primary, let's just assume that for simplicity's sake, all these people are registered Democrats. How do you think about polling, segmenting, or then targeting that electorate without the shorthand, or without that heuristic, without the crutch of voter ID? So one thing you can do here is you want to just, so I think what I'll say is, like, yeah, we think of party ID as like this kind of like rational calculation, this really kind of like, okay, party X stands for Y, therefore I support party D, right? Or whatever. I don't know. This is thinking about it like, oh, party X is going to raise my taxes, but that's fine because I make a lot of money. Or party X is going to raise my taxes versus I worked hard for that money, I don't want to, right? So whatever your sensibilities are, we think about this kind of like rational calculation in terms of which party we identify with. And that's true. I'm not saying that's not true, and I won't say that's not true, right? Especially it's going to be a mix of both for everybody. But the other way we can think about partisan identification is more of like a social identity, right? It's like, and we see this obviously with Donald Trump's voters, and one of the ways that he's been really successful is like he builds an identity among his voters, right? It's not just that they vote and vote Republican, or people vote and vote Democrat. It's that it's part of their social identity. Like they have the stickers, they have the outfit, they have the whole set of behaviors that kind of like show that you're a strong Democrat or a strong Republican or whatever, right? It's like sports teams a little bit, right? Not for everybody, but for some people. And we can think about these things in equal mix. Some people are just like really hardcore policy, ideological. Others are more like, oh, this is my favorite team. Right? So, but all those people are going to be partisans, and we but they're thinking about their partisanship as a social identity as much as they're thinking about it as like an ideological calculation, right? This rational thing. However, when we can then think that, so that's just one social identity. So the natural thing, and I think my suggestion and what we see in practice is that we should just focus on other forms of social identity to think about how we might differentiate or segment voters, right? So, okay. So, yeah, there's Democrats and Republicans, but those aren't the only two ways that we separate ourselves in society that we see big differences. One of the classic ones, no matter which side of the aisle you're on, so this works for Democrats and Republicans, is going to be age, right? Older voters care about a lot of different things than younger voters do. Younger voters are more open to change. Older voters more committed to the status quo. Older voters care about Medicare, Medicaid. You want a message and target around that. Younger voters probably more interested in either the job market or potential loan forgiveness, that kind of thing, right? What the economy looks like now, what the prospects are for people on the job market. Older voters are caring about their retirement, what the stock market looks like, right? This kind of thing. So age is going to be a way that you can always try to find some differences and find some leverage there. So if your candidate was potentially weak on Social Security or weak on education or something like that, you can then go to younger voters and say, like, I'm the education candidate, I'm better in education, and therefore in your targeting you want to target younger people, or maybe people with kids or in education. If you're the Social Security person, you want to call those older voters and remind them that their Social Security, the security of it is dependent on your election. Your opponent's gonna is not doesn't see it as a priority, right? So age is an easy one. So I'll go with Republicans first, if you can even see the agenda behind me. But I'll think about like how to target here for Republicans. So age is a good one, but generally your Republican voters are going to skew a little bit older anyway. So maybe this is less of a factor for Republicans than for Democrats, but in a primary it could still be a pretty big factor. So age would be the first one. The second one, and probably the most, I wouldn't say reliable, but maybe the easier one to identify, even though you're really not going to be able to get this from the voter file, but you can get it in a lot of other ways, right? Um, is religion for the Republican Party. So in religion, when we're thinking about this in the shorthand, or when you see it on election night on coverage like that, we're thinking about evangelical voters, right? So evangelical Protestant voters and non-evangelical. So we'd say, like, rather than like, I'm not trying to draw a big distinction here, but the segment that we're looking at is evangelical voters, and they make up a pretty big segment of the Republican Party. In some places, almost half of registered Republicans are going to be evangelical voters or think of themselves in that way. And the other thing to think about is evangelicals are highly kind of like it's a socially engaged faith and a socially engaged congregation. It's political in the sense that their leaders or their, whether it's the guy in front of the church or the leader of the more like an ideological leader, they're going to be political, and they're going to be motivated and mobilized by as a group, I would say, right? So like we can think about Republicans behave in a general election, we can think about Democrats behaving as a group and Republicans behaving as a group. Within a Republican elected, we can think the same way, right? Evangelicals are going to behave as a group within the context of this election. And you want to be the group you want to be the candidate that wins that group and not the candidate that loses that group, right? So that's one big way to think about how to target or how to segment the electorate in a Republican primary. I think the other way to think about this is along, I would say, like, on immigration is another. I would say if you looked at the data, but also if you looked at candidacies, and maybe I'm a little bit biased because the peak of my career was during the Tea Party movement, but I think we're seeing pretty similar stuff. So with the kind of like whether you get your pro-Trump Republicans or maybe your more Romney-esque Republicans, right? We see there's a big divide here on kind of like immigration, maybe more loosely described as nationalism, right? So you have your if you're looking at the electorate, you can look at foreign-born people that were born in the United States that are Republicans versus more kind of recent immigrants. So foreign-born versus native-born, I think would be the way to think about this with Republican Party. Those foreign-born Republicans, or this is gonna be less of a factor in the Republican Party than the Democrats, but we're thinking about like maybe Cuban Republicans right here. So Latinos or Hispanics that identify as Republicans are generally newer, are generally from immigrant communities, right? So we think about these kind of this group of Republican voters will have much different sensibilities than perhaps your more Trumpist or your more kind of Tea Party voter who's going to be almost exclusively white, right? Born in the United States, maybe 4 or 5 generations ago. So they date their ancestry back to like the colonial period. They think of themselves as American in that sort of way. Versus more recent immigrants who are attracted to the Republican Party because its lower taxes or pro-business environment, or like these because Republican Party under Reagan was seen as like the liberator from the Cold War. So people here that emigrated to the United States during the Cold War are typically going to be more Republican, at least registered Republican, than other vote than but like I said, have different sensibilities when it comes to immigration. So immigration is another way in which you can kind of develop a theory about which groups are going to support you versus which groups are going to support your opponent potentially. Another factor here, and we're seeing this more and more. Maybe we'll see this more in this election, but this is a feature of typical kind of Republican primaries, is that gender can be a really big issue, right? So you can target. So obviously, there's 50% of women and 50% of men in any typical electorate, right? Republican Party tends to skew just a little bit more male, but the issue of gender or women's issues or issues that typically we think of as things that maybe women as parents or as people who are typically more in these industries, right? We think about like women caring typically more about like things like education or healthcare than men typically would, right? So, and these are broad generalizations, obviously. You can tell that it kind of pains me to make them, but we're thinking about strategically targeting an electorate here. We are thinking about like the facts on the ground, and generally speaking, if we're messaging in a campaign, if we're talking about education, we're talking about healthcare, we're speaking more to female voters, to women, than we are to men about those issues. On the other side, also in a Republican primary, what you're going to get here, what you can develop kind of like a strategy around targeting, and what maybe groups will behave differently than others, would just be wealthy voters versus poor voters, right? Or less wealthy voters. Well, maybe in 3 groups here. So we can think about class at 3 levels, right? You're either doing really well, you're in that middle group, or you're doing poorly and you always done poorly or whatever, right? So in the Republican primary, you can kind of create a perception or target voters based on your candidate's policies around the issue of class, right? You can be the super pro-business growth kind of pro Wall Street, anti-tax, like kind of like really small L liberal when it comes to business. On the other hand, there's a huge, a big, I mean, I wouldn't say huge, but a big enough kind of chunk of the Republican electorate that puts a high value on government spending when it comes to Social Security and Medicare, but also national security, right? So they think of the government in a sort of way that they're opposed to big government, right? But they are also interested in maintaining the social services that are required for them because they're elderly, because they're veterans, because they're disabled from work or whatever, right? So you have a a segmentation within that Republican electorate that's either going to be like, go Wall Street, cut the taxes, privatize Social Security, but versus a group that's maybe like, okay, we want to use the government to do things that are important for us, like provide veterans benefits, build a big military, keep Social Security and Medicare intact because they earned it over the course of their lifetime, right? So there is a big difference among the Republican electorate. We might not think of this because typically at the presidential level, we get kind of your pro-business Republican, but a lot of Republican voters, especially if they're doing poorly, right? We're thinking about this terms of income. So these wealthier voters are going to be much more pro Wall Street than your poorer voters are going to be more invested in, like I said, these government programs, Social Security, Medicare, and things like maybe they might not be a veteran themselves, but things like supporting the VA, right? Whether, and this is going to be important whether you're running for local kind of like state or city office versus whether you're running for Senate or president, right? The VA is a big issue for Republicans, for everybody, but especially think about among Republicans. And you can think, and if for and the lower it has on the class ladder, the more Republicans will be invested in these kind of things like providing for their community, right? Providing for them as whether they worked all their life and they earned these benefits or they provided service to the country through their military service, right? That they rely on the government and they support the government's efforts to provide these services versus your pro-business thing might be like, oh, let's cut a lot of services that'll promote growth and industries and that kind of thing, right? So, and you can use class as a shorthand for doing that, right? So you'd expect lower income voters to be kind of that more kind of like I said, pro VA, pro services crowd. Your higher income voters be like, okay, I don't really need these services. I'm more invested in growing the economy as a whole. And then you have your middle class voters, and you can definitely target and message around the middle class. And I think so. I will use this as an opportunity to transition back to the Democratic Party and try to wrap this up. I'm going a little bit long. I'm sorry. This stuff's really interesting. There's a lot going on. So when we're targeting we can think about the middle class as kind of a group that acts and votes as a block, right? They're not as organized as evangelical voters or labor movement or whatever on the other side, right? But they kind of vote as a block. And we can think about suburban this is more as a suburban urban divide, right? As well as or urban or suburban versus rural divide. But suburban kind of middle class voters, especially when we're thinking about white voters here, tend to vote as a block together, and these groups tend to vote pretty regularly in primary elections. They vote pretty regularly in general. So and they're swingy, right? And this is the typical kind of person we think of as swingy in a general election. And if we think about that, they're potentially swingy in a general election, we could probably impute that they might be assume that they're probably going to be pretty swingy in general. So we might be able to get them in a primary as well. So middle class voters, when we want to target. We can think about ways in which we should target middle class voters. So middle class voters, they care about a couple of things. They care about their property. They care about their education because they're probably going to have kids or at least a bunch of dogs or something, right? So they care about their property value in a lot of ways. So for a lot of reasons, right? Because that's associated with the school system, it's associated with their mortgage, but they're relatively and they think about themselves as having upward mobility as well. So we can think about they're gonna be more attracted to that kind of like pro growth message. Your portfolio is going to grow or whatever, versus being already invested in something like Social Security or that kind of thing. So the middle class is going to be kind of upwardly mobile, but when we're targeting them, we want to think about them as caring about issues like education and whatever. So we can segment the electorate and think like, okay, we're going to go after these middle class kind of suburban voters, and we're going to focus on them and message towards them. And maybe that'll lose us some of the lower class voters who we're not speaking to based on their services, and it's going to lose us some of the higher class voters because we're talking about paying for a lot of services for education. But we can think that we're going to win these voters, and we're going to segment the electorate that way. And we can think about that for the Democratic Party as well, right? That the middle class among the Democratic Party, so voters that candidates like Bill Clinton were famous for kind of like targeting initially, right? So we want to grow the middle class in this kind of message. Middle class voters on the Democratic Party are really important too, and we can definitely think about class as being incredibly important for Democratic primaries as well. So we're segmenting the electorate there. So age is going to be a really important feature. We already talked about that for Democrats, right? A second one is going to be class. And you're going to get a big difference between voters who are in the middle class. So you're kind of like 20s, 30s. So you can look at age here to kind of like tease these voters up. You're also going to look at where they live, right? The neighborhoods that they live in, more importantly, right? This is going to be like a geographic kind of targeting when we're looking for the middle class a lot of the times. You're going to be able to segment the electorate that way. So I want to message my stuff at the middle class here versus like, a more populist, union, working class message, or a more kind of like, a more centrist, like pro-business, pro-growth, don't, maybe raise taxes only on the wealthy, but not on but cut taxes for everybody else kind of thing, right? Cut taxes to the middle class. Cutting taxes for the middle class. Oh my God. Campaign on that if you're on the Democratic side, right? If you can be the cut taxes for you, raise taxes for the other guy, especially in the Democratic Party, you can become president someday. But yeah, so if you can think about segmenting the electorate there, right? I'd raise taxes on everyone, kind of working class message versus a raise taxes only on the people above you kind of message. And provide more services for the people below you, perhaps. So we can think about the Democratic Party. That's being a really good way to use the voter file to kind of tease that out geographically or with age, right? So if they're Democrats and they're registered among Democrats and they're in their 30s and 40s, there's a possibility, especially if they're white, that they're going to be kind of these people who think of themselves as middle class. You can segment it that way. But the other one, typically the division along class lines you see in the Democratic Party is that more kind of upper class versus working class kind of division. Your Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton kind of thing, right? That way you can segment the electorate as well, right? You want to take and I think income there is going to be a big division, but also age again is going to be a way for you to use the resources you have, the voter file, to identify people who are going to support that like more kind of progressive message versus the more centrist message, right? So age is going to be a big divider here. So obviously, like Bernie Sanders crushed it with young people, and these kind of candidates, typically, the farther you're out there, you're going to do better with younger voters, right? So you can segment the electorate along age, but that's also kind of similar to segmenting along class, right? So when you're a kid, when you're younger, you typically don't have as much. The older in life you get, the more things that you accumulate, the more things that are important to you, whether it's a family, whether it's a house. So older voters are going to be more down for this kind of like grow the middle class, support education message. Okay. So age is a big one. Class is a big one for the Democratic Party. So whether you're focusing on that middle class and not the other, to the kind of, and less so the others, or you're doing this kind of like working class versus upper class, 99% versus 1% kind of Bernie Sanders thing, you can think about social class and kind of like income and wealth as a way to easily segment the electorate. So let me think about if I want to just touch briefly on some other things that are going to be important for Democrats. Oh, okay. Let's talk about the thing that maybe people aren't as comfortable talking about. Let's talk about how race and ethnicity might play a really big role here. So I touched on it briefly with the Republican Party about how the Republican Party is typically and obviously a much more a white party, right? So many more white people are registered Republican. The vast majority of Republicans are white, right? Something like 80-something%. But that doesn't mean that 20% isn't important, especially depending on where you're running, right? So I touched on for Republicans, this is gonna be less important, or just gonna come up less often. But we think about like Cuban Americans, Vietnamese Americans who were for a long time had a heavy kind of like tilt towards Republican registration. We talked about Reagan, that's why, right? But we can think about that in Republican electorates. But more importantly, more often we're thinking about this issue of race and ethnicity when it comes to Democratic electorates, right? Because the Democratic Party is just has much more racial diversity among its members, right? And that's obviously not everywhere, right? Not in South Dakota, essentially, right? But probably in most places, you're going to see a much more diverse electorate racially for the Democratic Party. And race isn't a really important feature. Race is a very important and almost the most important feature of American politics, right? So whether we talk about it or not, this is an incredibly important thing that's going on. And you're whether you're a person of color or whether you're a white person that cares about issues of racial inequality or racial justice, you're going to probably be more likely to be in the Democratic Party, right? So whether we're talking, so race is going to be an issue for the Democrats, whether we're talking about, a diverse electorate or we're just talking about thinking about what voters care about. There's going to be a big difference. So let's think about white voters particularly here when it comes to race in the Democratic Party. You're going to get a pretty big difference between a chunk of voters who care deeply about race, even though they're white, right? They care about racial inequality, versus a group of Democrats who are less concerned about race and are more focused on the issue of maybe on other issues, like they think of things in a class sort of way, right? They don't see race as important um, as white people as other people do, right? There's gonna be pretty big divide there, and that might be a way to segment the electorate. But really, we're talking about our practical purposes, right? There's going to be a difference between, especially if you have different people of different ethnicities and races in the primary, right? So if you have a black candidate and a white candidate, or maybe, a couple of different candidates, so an Asian candidate, Latino candidate. So we're thinking about maybe the San Francisco election here, right? Where you're getting 17 candidates representing all sorts of different races and ethnicities, right? You're getting more diversity here, but we do know that voters, for one reason or another, are more likely to vote for someone that's like them, right? So we can think about this in terms of race, right? Like a white voter is more likely to vote for a white candidate, black voter more likely to vote for a black candidate. But really, this is much more about like the issues that the candidates talk about, right? And how they talk about the issues of race as much as like the policies they offer, right? So we can think about this like as a candidate, whether you're white or black, or whether the electorate's white or black, in the Democratic Party, the issue of race is going to be really important. So it's not to say that you need to be right a member of that group to win support, but you need to be good on the issue of racial justice at least, right? So you can think about the electorate in that way from a more kind of like rudimentary perspective. Ethnic mobilization is a feature of the American electorate, right? So people see someone who looks like them and assume, rightly or wrongly, that that person's going to be better for them on the issues. There's going to be some solidarity there. So thinking about targeting voters, if you're, say, if you're an Asian candidate, you want to target Asian voters, right? Or you want to think or talk about issues that are important to them. This would be true for any race. So if you're the white candidate, you want to talk to your white voters in a way that lets them know that you support kind of what you support the issue of racial equality, but you won't do so maybe what they perceive at their expense. So this is obviously it's not a third rail because it's the rail in American politics, right? Like race is a factor here, racial politics is a factor, and this is going to be a feature much more so in Democratic electorate just by nature of the diversity of that electorate, right? Most of the reason this happens because it's typically where we are talking about class a lot of the times when we're talking about race, right? Because typically the issues that are important for these communities of color are going to be issues surrounded around the working class or issues of services, issues of discrimination, right? But typically your white voters, even if they're concerned about racial justice and progressive on that issue, they're going to be, in general, better off. They're going to be much more likely to be middle class. They're going to be invested in the status quo in a way that the people of color in your district maybe are not because of their historical circumstances, right? So when you're targeting voters, you have to keep this in mind. You can't, maybe if you want, even if you wanted to ignore it, you shouldn't. You need to, first of all, think about the racial politics of your candidacy. Think about how your racial identity, how you think about race, and how that's gonna be perceived in the electorate among people that share your identity, but also people that don't. You have to think about both. But there's gonna be segments of the electorate that are associated with their like racial groups that are gonna be some issue is going to be more important to some than others, right? So, I mean, just if you think about this issue, so in a lot of primaries, as a Democrat, no matter what you're running for this year, you're going to be asked if you support the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Or if you um, support the protests in advance of that issue, or whatever, right? And your answer on your answer on that question is going to matter deeply for your ability to target and mobilize voters in your primary election. You're going to be appealing to people based on how you answer that question, regardless of whether they share your identity or not. And also, the consequences are going to be really important for people that do share your identity. They want to see what how you're approaching the issue, right? Whether you're white or not, the voters that share your racial identity are going to care a lot about your views on race. So, but you can use that as a way to strategically target voters. So if you look at your electorate and you have a high percentage of Latinos in your district, you're going to be able to segment the electorate and know that a lot of the people in this primary election, maybe more often than a lot of other primary elections, are going to care a lot about the issue of immigration, the issue of citizenship, these kind of things, right? So you can segment the electorate like that. If you have a large, like I said, a large percentage of your district that's African American, you can segment the electorate by being the candidate who's better on racial justice and advance the cause that way. And so, like, my opponent doesn't care as much about this movement, right? So this, you don't have to be a member of the racial group to be good on these issues, right? Or to segment the electorate this way, but you think about your electorate in a way that they're going to care about the issues disproportionately or proportionately into the order which those issues matter for their lives, right? So it's just the fact that for white people, these issues of racial justice or issues of immigration, while they may care about them, they're going to be lower priority than they are for voters who are physically dealing with these circumstances every day. It's just a feature of life, right? This would be more true on the Republican or Democratic side, right? Just because of the nature of the diversity of the electorate. But Republicans, the issue of race is also incredibly important, right? So I'm sure that Republican candidates also, no matter what they're running for, are asking if they support Black Lives Matter, if they support Blue Lives Matter, or whatever, right? So this issue of race is going to be important in your election, and it's a way for you to segment and think about your electorate in terms of groups and how groups vote together. And typically, groups vote together, right? So evangelicals vote together, but also African Americans, white people vote together on issues that kind of concern them as groups and issues like racial justice too. So you can think about the electorate in that sort of way and strategically develop your campaign strategy at the macro level, but also like in terms of targeting of who you think is going to support you. And racial groups in general perform or work and think and vote as if they're groups, right? As Republicans, as we think Republicans all vote in a certain sort of way, we can think of whites or white people as all voting in a certain sort of way, right? White Democrats as voting in a certain sort of way, white Republicans voting in the same certain sort of way, right? We think about it as in general another sort of way to segment the electorate. So we have age, we have income, we have class, we have geography, we have ethnicity, um, we have in some cases you'll have I don't know, home ownership, these kind of things, right? So we can think about ways in which groups of people in primary electorates vote together and might vote as like Republicans, as Democrats do, as a block, and ways in which we can segment those. So yeah, I hope that was helpful in terms of a theoretical perspective, but also like maybe practically interesting. So in the voter file, you're gonna have a lot of this stuff. At the very least, you're going to have like their address, right? You're going to have this geographic information and be able to like think like, oh, this is the middle class neighborhood, right? Or whatever. And there's obviously other ways. So we're thinking about targeting evangelical voters. You're going to go through the church and try to go that way, right? If you're targeting African American voters, you also kind of can go through the church on that side as well, right? With that group as well is going to be pretty active in mobilization and pretty political, right? We think about that sort of engagement with religion as well. So all these things are going to be more or less true on both sides, maybe more true for some than others. Think about the so religion, class, race, gender. We talked about a little bit. So these are all ways in which you can just think a little bit harder about how social groups or how groups of people might think or vote or work or at least interact together. I mean, you can organize and target your campaign and target voters in that sort of way. So practically, let's think about this. So on the ground, you might have a district which is 25%. Oh, I think I should. This is a big one as well, especially if the Republican Party education of voters. I'll kind of just quickly go there and then wrap this up. So education is a huge split, especially among Republican voters. Those who went to college, right, went to 4-year college or above, and are now kind of working more of like a white collar job, that kind of like social identity, right, or that kind of person or that kind of class of person, they're going to have much different opinions on a wide variety of issues than Republican voters who didn't get as high a level of education. But we want to think about these education at the same time with class, right? So we can think about two separate situations. So you can think about people who weren't able to get a great or get a lot of education, right? Didn't go to 4-year college or whatever, and therefore aren't doing well economically, right? But we can think of like a lot of Republicans though, and a lot of especially maybe more Tea Party or we looked at the data for Donald Trump, see though more of those who didn't really go to like a fancy school or didn't go to college, but still did pretty well for themselves, right? And we can think about a lot of people like this, whether they started their own business, whether they're an entrepreneur, all these sorts of things, whether they just kind of like worked their way up to management eventually, right? Whether started at the bottom and worked their way up, right? These kind of voters with low education but higher incomes, like middle class or high incomes, are thinking about issues in a lot different ways than people that are maybe born wealthy or people that are lower class. We think about the middle class, but we think about how to find them. We can look for education, right? People that had a 4-year degree, a college degree, voted much differently than voters who didn't have that degree in the Republican Party. We can think about segmenting the electorate in that sort of way, right? Are they these upper class kind of educated people versus the less educated, kind of upwardly mobile kind of people? And breaking down the electorate in that sort of way, you know, is going to be in a really effective way to help you target who is going to be for you, who is going to be for the other guy in your election. So we've gone through a handful of things here, and sorry, it's a little bit disorganized, but said these things. There's a lot going on here. Maybe some differences for Republicans, differences for Democrats, or whatever. But what we want to think about is that, in principle, the same way we think that Republicans and Democrats work together and are going to vote, are going to be predictable in a general election, voters in primaries maybe are a little bit less predictable, but voters in general are still pretty predictable. And we can use the voter file and we can use things like Vote Builder and Van, these additional sources of information about voters, or what you learn when you're knocking on doors or making phone calls, that people behave like social identities function as just like Republican and Democrat do, these other social identities, whether it's class, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's geography, urban versus rural, whether it's white collar versus blue collar, working class or whatever, right? All these kind of like social identities, all these groups that we think about as that we are parts of, right, can also be ways in which we segment the electorate in primaries. So there's a lot of things going. So we talked about age, we talked about race, we talked about education, we talked about class, we talked about gender, we talked about geography. So these are all potential ways in which you can segment your electorate, but it's all going to come down to the numbers, right? You want to tie this back to how what looks like what you're doing well with in the polling, what people like about you, or where your opponent is weak, right? So if your opponent is not performing well, then you want to identify those issues, but you can segment the electorate into who's going to be for you on those issues and who isn't, based on these things that we can either access from the voter file or access in these other sort of kind of readily accessible ways. Age is a big one, easy to find in the voter file. Geography is another one that you can readily have access to. Their gender obviously is in there, and then pretty quickly whether almost I think only the state of South Carolina officially tracks respondents' race on their voter thing, but things like surname matching and also the geography thing here will also be a help for you in terms of identifying racial or ethnic groups that you may be able to target in terms of your messaging and get either more performance or a higher share out of because of the issues that you're supporting or how you're talking about the issues, right? Um, and then just simple things like social group affinity, right? It is the case that voters want to vote for someone who's like them. And we can think about whether like them can mean a lot of different things, right? Whether it's the person you want to have a beer with, or the person that shares your racial group or shares your class identity, shares your gender identity, like whatever, right? All those things are important for voters and are important for primary voters, but are ways you should think about and think about targeting the electorate when you go about that. So I hope that was useful. I hope that was interesting. I hope that was informative. Um, and I guess I'll wrap up there. So thank you for joining me, and obviously please let me know if you have more questions. So my experience, like I said, my experience working on that primary campaign. So the first one, we I came on right at the end of the primary. They knew that I worked for the party, so they knew they were going to need someone, whether whoever won. Um, there was so within the organization there was some lingering resentment among the people who supported the guy who lost, and they were still working on the campaign during the general, and that wasn't the easiest thing to navigate, which is an interesting part of primary elections. Maybe it's a little bit off topic, but and it was kind of like due to this way in which the electorate was segmented, which we decided, which it became kind of this labor versus the more business oriented part of the Democratic Party, right? And there was lingering resentment among those people in the campaign, and even we experienced on the phones later on among voters as well. But at the end of the day, our data indicated that almost all of those people ended up voting for us anyways, right? Partisans still act like partisans. I think that's maybe the way I'll close this set of lectures, is that we've been talking for kind of 2 hours almost about how um, we want to think about a context in which partisanship isn't important, right? All the people share partisanship, where other things are important when we think about breaking them up. But let's get back to this idea of like kind of almost no matter what happens during that primary election, almost all of those people, whether they liked you or not, whether they voted for you or not, are going to end up being strong partisans in the general election. So this should assuage some fears, but also it's how you can think about this in terms of who you're targeting and who you aren't. So you want to still, when you're in a primary, ideally you want to be targeting people still who you think are going to show up in the general election. You don't want people who are maybe just so far out in the fringes one way or the other that they're only interested in this primary challenge but aren't going to be interested in the general election. So partisans stay home, and that makes it easy for us to predict general elections, but as you saw over the course of this lecture, it makes it a little bit trickier targeting in primaries and thinking about primaries. We rely so heavy on this party identification. When we don't have it, what do we do? And as we said, we think about age, we think about class, we think about education levels, we think about race and ethnicity, we think about gender, we think about all these other ways in which there are big differences, like it or not, in our society, and ways in which our politics, thinks differently about those things. So we always go back to the issues, we always go back to voters. We think about this thing. If we want to win campaigns, we have to meet voters where they're at. And a lot of voters think about politics and think about um, I don't know, elections or campaigns or voting in these very kind of like in these shorthand ways. When we don't have the shorthand of partisanship, what shorthands do we use? We use other social identities, other divisions within our society become important. So within these parties are pretty diverse ideologically, ethnically, all these different kind of things, right? So we think about big differences within parties. Those are the ways that we target voters to win those primaries. We think this part of the party is stronger, or we can be stronger with this part of the party versus the other part of the party. So it makes it a little bit harder technically, right? But you don't have the same, like I said, the same easy access to Republicans versus Democrats in Van or in Vote Builder or on the voter file or whatever, right? But there are these other things that are just as reliable, almost as just as reliably predictive of voter behavior. They're not party ID, but they're things like age, class, that kind of stuff. Okay, so thanks for joining me again, and I look forward to talking to y'all in the future.